Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Biblical Rogues Gallery, or tonight it's more like a Rogues panel of two. Not much of a gallery here tonight, but maybe others will pop in as the show goes on. But we have, I know that Will is on a missions thing, and Nick's, even though he's in the chat, he's like, I'm so tired. But I do thank him for making the PowerPoint. And other people may or may not jump in. I did order Leighton Flowers to definitely be here next week. But Tim Barber, we've invited him. We've invited Dr. Phil Fox and some new people because all the old people are old. But we'll see. We'll see who comes. Or maybe it's just me and Derek. So all the people on the other live streams that say that I talk too much, this is not the live stream for you because I'm going to be talking a lot. Anyway, Derek, how are you doing?
Oh, having a good evening. Enjoying the Monday as much as one can.
Now, you had a birthday party tonight for your grandmother.
Yep, I did. And then I hurried home because I needed to keep you from having to do this all by yourself.
Well, I mean, it would have been fine. I would choose my grandmother over me, but that's fine. Yeah, I actually love this section of Romans 8. And this is kind of that section before it gets to the good stuff that the theology nerds are so interested in arguing over, you know, with the Romans 8, 28 through 31, and really 28 through 30. So let's skip all over this stuff about being co-heirs with Christ. Not a big deal. This stuff about crying out to God as Abba Father. No big deal. New creation, boring, right? I mean, that's kind of the attitude was like, well, when people think of Romans 8, they want to get to the first few verses. The pastors like the first few, therefore no condemnation. That preaches good. And then they want to get, even the pastors, not just the theology nerds, but even the pastors, they want to get all the way down. So if they're an Arminian pastor with an axe to grind, they want to grind that axe. If they're a Calvinist pastor with an axe to grind, they want to, harp on that. And, provisionists, they want to tweet about these verses. But I like these verses we're covering tonight. I think it's 12 through 25. Then we'll pick back up in 26, which I thought that was a weird place for Nick to, chop it off at. I would have gone over 27, but hey, when you're not doing the PowerPoint, you have a buddy who'll do it for you. You don't complain. So, but he can show up next week and tell us why he did that. But
I strongly suspect we might have a bigger audience next week in preparation for what you were just talking about, those big debatable verses.
Yeah, because no one wants to show up and listen to stuff about suffering and the sufferings we endure comparing to the glory that is to come and all. Who cares, right? I mean, N.T. Wright spent a decade of his career trying to make people care about this passage, oddly enough. But then he moved on to other things, But, this ties back into the opening where, as Nick so eloquently put it in chapter 1, verses 18 and following, you have the decline of civilization. And, since the creation of the world, God's been evident, but yet people didn't want to have him. And he's returning to that creation theme yet again here, talking about creation itself with Christ's people, the church, caught in the midst of all of that decline of civilization and chaos, and their enduring sufferings and all of that. And very relatable unless you have a very cushy life, So,
our affluence gets in the way.
Yeah, but there's interesting stuff that he picks up on, the co-heirs with Christ. That's the inheritance language. It reminds me of that verse everyone looks at. I harped on this and back in Romans chapter 5 that everyone looks up at that who's going to reign? Well, it's those who have received the grace, So also, where is that in chapter 5? So just to say, right. So also, those are the grace reign through. No, that's not it. Oh yeah. So if by verse 17, if by one man's trespass death reigned through that one man, how much more will those, meaning Christians, who receive the overflow of grace and the gift of righteousness, that's us, reign in life? How much more will all of us who've received all that reign in life? Thank God for Junior. He'll come save us.
Oh, don't thank God just yet.
Or ruin the whole thing. Anyway, your accent elevates the whole program, as I say every week. But so there's that bit there about being a co-heir with Christ. There's that bit there with reigning in life through Christ. I mean, that's awesome. And if we were to get political, I'd say that's also this idea, you know, when you say Jesus Christ, you know, if you go back to Isaiah, King of Kings presumes that there's other kings, right? He is the King of Kings, but who is reigning? Who's reigning with Christ in the new heavens and earth? That's believers, which is why I tell people, I say, you know, people ask me why my politics is anarchy. I'm like, well, that's what God wanted before they stopped wanting God to be their king in Israel and decided to get earthly kings against God's. You don't want this, right? You don't want this. And for everybody in the already not yet, and we'll get into this, I'm gonna harp on this when we get to Romans 13, but just as a preview, God didn't want Israel to have a king. This was after the book of Judges, by the way. I mean, how awful were the people in that book? You know, but still, it's like, you don't want a king. Gave him a king, gave him the government that everyone's fighting about in the election year over here. Be glad. Well, you guys already had your election over there, and that seemed like that was a mess too for you guys, Junior. But our election is going to be a mess. No matter who wins, it's going to be a mess. I'm telling you, just let Christ be your king, and may God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And if we are the now but not yet, the already but not yet, let's have a little bit more already in our not yet and quit worrying about it. Govern thyself. You know,
well, you bring up an interesting point too, because it wasn't just that they wanted a king, but that was they were rejecting God in wanting a king.
Right.
So are we doing that when we rely so heavily on the next politician we're going to elect into office? Are we basically saying, look, Lord, I don't trust you. I'm going to put my eggs in this basket with this guy or girl?
Yeah. Well, no, it's like, okay, so I'm old enough now. I'm 47, so I've lived through a lot of election cycles. I've seen Trump be Jesus. Be our Jesus, Trump. Please be our Jesus. Before Trump, it was Obama. Please be our Jesus. Hillary Clinton made fun of Obama in the 2008 primary, where she was like, oh, and you know, the sky will open and the celestial angels will start singing. And she was making fun of him because they were all running around saying, Pilate was a governor, but Jesus was a community organizer. You know, taking shots at Sarah Palin versus, you know, Obama was Jesus. People, I see these young people now, these young Christians are like, I can't stand those memes of Trump and Jesus. And I'm like, this is nothing new in politics. This is go back to 2008. We've been seeing this all the time. If it's not the Republicans, it's the Democrats. Everybody does this because one of the signs of decadence and decline in a nation is you're looking for charismatic leaders to save you, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a sign of decline. America used to be where if somebody became president and you didn't like it, you're like, okay, well, that stinks, but you get on with life. But now everything is political. Politics is not downstream from culture anymore. Politics is now our pop culture. Everything is political now. We have entertainment that is either made for the left or made for the right, right? Very little actual art. That's not. I mean, Hollywood has adopted. If you're more to the political left, get over it. I'm going to trash you because Hollywood has adopted the worst aspect of Christian filmmaking. Right. The worst thing about Christian filmmaking is that they are so preachy with their messages. Right. There's no subtlety. There's no nuance to it. And now in our politics, there's so much preachiness of, whatever secular leftist values in our entertainment. And I'm like, now your stuff is as bad as Christian movies. Thank you. Great. Now we can't watch anything. This is why we can't have nice things. So I want to get us back to a place in society that if you must have a government, at least don't worry about it. So I know that sounds like a Talking Head song, also dates me, but they have a song called "Don't Worry About the Government." But I'm like, can we care less about this? And the only way to do that is for the government to not be that important to our lives. And so they need to get out of our lives so that, anyway, that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. But I will if you thought that 7-minute rant was long, just wait till we get to me knocking down the things that people throw back at me from, what about Romans 13? Well, we'll get to Romans 13. All right.
It's coming.
It's coming. But today we're talking about new creation, where we won't have American politics in film or on social media all the time. All right. I read last week or 2 weeks ago when we did the show. So one of you guys read for me.
I haven't read in many, many weeks.
All right, go for it.
All right. So then, brothers and sisters, we are under obligation not to the flesh to live according to the flesh. For if you are living in accord with the flesh, you are going to die. But if by the Spirit you are putting to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all who are being led by the Spirit of God, these are sons and daughters of God. For you have not received a spirit of slavery leading to fear again, but you have received a spirit of adoption as sons and daughters, by which we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, heirs also, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the eagerly awaiting creation waits for the revealing of the sons and daughters of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. And not only that, but also we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons and daughters, the redemption of our body. For in hope we have been saved, but hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what he already sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, through perseverance we wait eagerly for it.
Amen. So one of the things that strikes me about this passage, first and foremost, is the theme of kinship. And what we would, those interested in like the social sciences, what they would term this fictive kinship. And so there's a lot of familial language in this passage. And going back a few episodes, we talked about, honor, shame, and all of that. Well, your honor ratings in the ancient Mediterranean world, you get the ascribed honor that has to do with your lineage, has to do with where you're from, the family to which you were born, all of that kind of thing. That's ascribed to you. Okay, that's not acquired or achieved honor. You didn't do anything to achieve it. That's the other kind of honor that you could get for yourself in sort of more of a meritocratic sense. But ascribed honor is just that which you have by birthright. Okay. And of course, one of the most famous adoptions in the ancient world would have been Julius Caesar adopting Octavian, who became Caesar Augustus. So there was like his great nephew or something. The fictive kinship that could be formed through common interests or common goals could even be stronger than blood relations in some cases. And one of the things that confuses a lot of Christians about this kinship language is you hear a lot of people trying to score rhetorical points. This will tie us into one of the things that Paul says in verse 14. For if you live according to the flesh, you are going to die. But if by the Spirit you are putting to death the deeds of the body, you will live. And we talked about this on the last program. I think it was 2 weeks ago. We got into the once saved, always saved or whatever. And of course, we're going to get to the verse 25. I think our Wesleyan friend stuck with the translation of perseverance instead of other translators make that patience, but perseverance is a better word. This idea of perseverance, people think, well, if you can't be unborn once you're born, right? So if you're a once eternal security person or a perseverance of the saints person, they think that, well, you can't undo that. They don't realize that. And I stress this when we get to 1 Peter, which is where I want to go whenever a million years when we're done with Romans. I talk about this new birth, born again language is not identical to the language of like new creature in Christ. That's metamorphosis. That's about transformation. Whereas born again is more about kinship. And if you notice that you get this new birth or born again, or if you must, born from above, but I don't think that's what Jesus is saying to Nicodemus. It's not trying to wordplay him to death. But there's already enough wordplay with the spirit and wind. It's not a riddle. Mm-hmm. So, I stick with Ben Witherington on that. But this born again, you can find it in like Jewish diaspora texts, Joseph and Asenath. It's familial conversion language, and it has to do and I know some people are going to argue that this part of Joseph and Asenath could be a later Christian interpolation. Great, that tells us what early Christians were thinking if they added that. So it already tells us what they had in mind. So that doesn't do anything to the arguments against this. It's like the longer ending of Mark. People say, well, that's not original. And I'm like, so what? It tells us what early church people thought about what to expect after the incarnation and the ascension of Christ and the apostles. So it's later than that, and they still expected. So I always tell my cessationist friends, anytime I bring up Mark, the longer ending of 16, 9 through the end of the book chapter, I'm like, yeah, but that's what the early church, that was their expectation for those kinds of things. Now,
where do you think it came from, even if it's not original?
So I'm not running to Kentucky to go handle snakes, okay, like they do, but still, it gives us a sense of what. So even if you think that this one section of Joseph and Asenath was not Second Temple, but where they use that clear born again language there for making Asenath, in Genesis, Joseph marries Asenath, and you don't really hear much about her at all, right? Well, there's a pseudepigraphical book in the Second Temple era that talked about, well, Jews wanted to write something to make sense of that. And so they wrote this story of their whole thing, and she had to become a quote-unquote sister in order for her to be a suitable wife, meaning that she had to have a new familial lineage to make sense for why Joseph is marrying this pagan, even though Joseph himself predates, the Mosaic covenant. So it's weird how they do this, but they do a lot of retconning. Like they're all, the Hebrew people are all Jews too, and you find a lot of that in the Second Temple literature. But even if you think that this little part about talking about being born again is later, that's what the Christians were thinking about it. So there's a lot of stuff in James and in Peter and in Jesus' conversation. Why was it important to talk about being born again to largely Jewish audiences? And if you understand your New Testament, it's because being born Jewish is not simply enough to be a part of the covenantal people anymore, right? So, So the kinship, and that's not to exclude becoming a new creature in Christ and all of that stuff, but if you make regeneration language and transformation metamorphosis language run roughshod over these concepts of kinship, you're missing out on what's actually being said to Nicodemus, or what Peter is saying about the new birth in chapter 1, or what James is saying about this kinship bonds. So yes, new creation, all that too, but really you're getting a new divine lineage, a new ascribed honor to you. And fictive kinships can be stronger than blood kinships, and you can disown family in the ancient world, and you can break kinship bonds. Blood kinship bonds can be broken. And so when someone's talking to me about, well, how can born again people be unborn again? I'm like, well, you're completely That's a clever
Yeah.
line, but it's completely ignorant of. And now I'm not saying that the once saved, always saved, perseverance of the saints, those provisionists and Calvinists who are all Calvinists on that one point. The only technically original idea that was Calvin's was this idea of, Augustine had his ways of dealing with that, and Luther had his ways, but Calvin was the eternal security guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And half the provisionists are on that team, and the other half aren't. But and Arminians, half of the Arminians are with the Calvinists on that, and the other half aren't. Depends on the Arminian on that eternal security point. But my point is, ain't nothing set in stone on your understanding of kinship bonds in the ancient Mediterranean world. You need to study up on that. Though I will say that, Augustus did become Caesar as an adopted child. So adoption can be just as powerful as a blood kinship, right? If not more so.
Yeah.
Even in the United States laws today, those who adopt a child, and you have actually more expectations, even in some of the legal codes, for your responsibilities to your adopted child than even placed on like natural parents. So it's kind of interesting like that's still around.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that jumps out is this kind of, you've got this language of adoption. You've got this language of kinship.
Abba, Father.
Yeah. So God is Father, and therefore all of your fellow believers are brothers and sisters. This is to foster that familial bond between all of you, that you have been placed in this new lineage, that no matter what your social status, where you're from, what your socioeconomic background is, whether you are a freed slave or even perhaps still a slave, or you were a slave holder, or whatever you were you were a Roman citizen, you were not a Roman citizen, all of that becomes equalized in the body of Christ here, because they're all your brothers and sisters, and you are all joint heirs and co-heirs with Christ. So it is like the ultimate equalizer of all believers. And so I don't think Christians think enough about that, because I know for the past, like just thinking about just practical matters in the church, how much authority should the pastors have, and why aren't pastors disciplining the church members enough? Those are the kind of conversations we have, but those conversations take place in hierarchical frameworks and not in familial frameworks. Notice that all of this stuff, we can call people Brother Jim and Brother Ted and Sister Mary and Sister Bertha all day long on Sunday morning, but do we really incorporate that kind of familial framework into our ecclesiastical structures of the local church or your larger denominations or whatever? And I think because we gloss over this to get to the good stuff about predestination and foreknowledge and calling and all of that, we don't bother ourselves thinking, what does it mean for all of these people I'm sitting in this pew with, some of which I may not want to be in the same room with on certain Sundays? Why can I think that? Even if I say, why am I not thinking about this as family with not just whatever your ascribed honor? What, right? I'm born from Arkansas, so the rest of the, if not Mississippi, thank God for Mississippi. The rest of the United States thinks Arkansas is, a bunch of backwater. We don't have anything to offer, whatever. But yet now I'm a co-heir of the new heavens and new earth with Christ, right? So no matter what your background is, and where you are on that socioeconomic ladder, you are as much a co-heir as the next person, the wealthy person, the patron of the church.
Well, and
you're from Missouri, so you're trash too. So
we got it. Well, I was going to say, like read through Romans 8 and ask yourself, which part of Romans 8 do you think Paul finds most important? Is it the, where we get hung up on the debates about predestination and all that, or is it about stuff like this, like the familial being in Christ and everything that comes with that, like all that spiritual stuff? Because that's like verses 1 through 27 at least, and then we don't even get to the predestination until like 28 through 30. and we don't touch it again, you know?
Right.
So we spend so much time debating that, whereas, you know, I think stuff like this is much more impulse focused than all that metaphysical stuff.
Right. And here we are. What should be, if we understood this, like, and it's not like too foreign of a concept, this ancient idea of ascribing honor. I mean, you know, can anything good come out of Nazareth? They had that back then. It's like, because the implied answer was no way, right? Nothing good could come from Nazareth. That's a dump, right? That sounds like, can anything good come out of Missouri or Arkansas for that matter? But whatever you make of that, I've been placed into a new family with a new lineage, which comes with it the ascribed honor of the Lord of the cosmos and the creator God of the cosmos. What better family can you be a part of? You know, how much more honor can you have ascribed to it? Which this is going to matter next week too, when we get into discussions about glorification, what that means, what to be glorified, right? So it's like, we need to pay attention to this, because all of this is coming in the context of people who are clearly suffering in this passage.
Yep.
Tying it back to, you know, once again, instead of the latter half of Romans 5, I mean, Paul comes to, we talked about how the end of Romans 8 kind of, what was it? The something Phine, something that I called it, was an Ecclesio, but I was calling a DS Alphinae or something like, as a musical term.
Oh, yeah. I really should look that up to make sure you have that right.
Yeah, well, I was corrected in the chat, and then now I've forgotten, since that was weeks ago. But anyway, so it comes back to this idea where Paul talks about that in but we also boast in our afflictions, verse 3 of chapter 5. So this is, you know, and that there's a goal to that. You know, it produces endurance and character and hope. And so all of this is coming to a crescendo here, right? All of these ideas that he's had is coming to a crescendo here, and saying that in the midst of this, you are a family and you have a future with Christ. You have God as your father, so that even as creation groans and you're groaning and all of that, you've got creation itself waiting for the sons and daughters of God to be revealed, you know, and we're waiting for the redemption of our bodies and all of this stuff. And the Spirit is groaning within us, you know, and I know that charismatics make a little bit of that too. That's one of the, like, Gordon Fee would appeal to that passage to help, you know, when he's talking about, you know, angelic languages and ecstatic utterances and all of that coming, you know, you're just kind of joining along with the Spirit on these unintelligible, unspeakable groanings and all of that. Now, I don't know how far you can go with that. I don't judge people like him who do. I'm kind of with N.T. Wright's, like, you know, I'm with you. I don't mind ecstatic utterances. I mean, I believe that's what all speaking in tongues was. But I mean, it's like, I don't know that that's what this passage is getting at. But if you want to read it there, I'm, you know, like Ben Witherton, I don't see it there, but I'm not going to be mad at you for it. But there's a lot going on here.
Right.
Yes.
We don't need to just lose sight of the biggest picture so far in Romans that Paul is painting on this canvas. But I've talked enough. I'll let y'all take it away.
I was just going to say, just to further the last thing you said about, like, what's actually being said here and stuff we miss, like, because you can get into the creation debate whenever you talk about the creation being subjected to futility and its slavery to corruption. You could get into the tongues debate whenever you get to verse 26 and the Spirit groaning. You can get to the Calvinism and versus other views whenever you get to 28 through 30. You can get to the eternal security debate when you get to 38 through 39. And it's just like, well, why don't we set all that aside for a little bit? And what is Paul's point? Not what debates can we, you know, stoke the flames of as we go through this, which, you know, I'm always willing to do that, but also not at the cost of what his main central point is with all this. And honestly, like, when I read through this, I've used these passages before to help people who are suffering and who are feeling down and stuff like that. It's like, I find that way more important. You know, that's more your pastoral aspect to it. And nobody outside the internet cares about those debates.
Yeah, and going back to what you mentioned prior to, and even what JP mentioned, it's like the more, because what you guys are focusing on primarily is the economic context, right? And exactly what you're saying. Yes, regeneration and salvation and so on and so forth. Metamorphosis, metamorpho. These are I would say philosophical terms that were brought in, which of course we adhere to. But just look, I think we miss a lot, and I'm just kind of reharping but when I actually read this in light of what you guys are saying, hashtag David De Silva. And there's some others out there as well that mention this as well. But going back to what you said, JP, regarding John, even the first chapter of John, he carries this, and we'll go back to Romans, as I said, but John carries the same familial language even before we get to chapter 3. And
to them he gave the right to be sons and daughters of God. Yeah,
right. Even to
many as received him. Yeah,
exactly. So that's the first chapter. Then when you read chapter 3, as you mentioned, and then chapter 8, where he says, whom the Son sets free is free indeed. And when you look into that conversation, he goes, well, the whole metaphor with, a slave is in the house, but the son is the heir of the house, and whom the Son sets free is free indeed. He's literally telling the Jews, okay, you're in the house, but you're not in the house as sons. You're in the house as slaves. John chapter 8. And but the Son, which is Christ, is the heir of the house, and whom the Son sets free is free indeed. In other words, I can change you from servitude into sonship if you just believe on who I am. So again, it's this whole familial type of language from chapter 1, chapter 3, chapter 8, right the way through, even into the last chapter. You may believe he is the Christ, and I believe in him who has life in his name. So when you look at Romans, the passage that we're in now, and looking at it through that little social economic context, right, of family, and it goes back into what you mentioned, I think more than 3 weeks ago, when I kind of gave the statement where in Romans, where Paul, even though he goes off of on his tantrums or whatever, but when he keeps coming back to a central point, which is the latter part of Romans, like chapter 12 plus, where, okay, the church is now, if you want to say the remnant Jews and Gentiles, how do we coexist? And I think you mentioned, well, can that coexisting with Jew and Gentile who are now family, can that be attained under the Mosaic law? And it's like, no, because, there is Jews, their culture, Gentiles, their culture, but we have all received the spirit of adoption. So we're now family. How are we going to coexist? And so I think this familial context gets overlooked through systematic theology on more cases than one. And I've myself been guilty to that. But looking at it through this lens, Paul is talking, I don't think philosophically, I think socially and economically.
Yeah, absolutely.
That we are one family. And he's speaking in that kind, what Nick Quinn mentioned a few weeks ago, slaves to, this slavery kind of imagery and being bound and now being loose. These are social economic terms. So yes, we can derive philosophy from this, fine. But I think it's definitely embedded with social economical terms like family and slavery and so on and so forth. And we kind of overlook that when we just simply go straight for the philosophical jugular. So, spirit of adoption.
It's probably easy too, because we don't think in familial terms like they did.
Yeah,
definitely not to the same degree.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, one of the things you mentioned kind of ties into this question for Pritchett, but it goes, Junior, what you were just saying. Why does Paul seem to be saying that Christians are awaiting this type talking? Why does Paul seem to be saying that Christians are awaiting this type talking about? I'm not sure how that. Well, okay, so hey, Nick's got a second win. There are you're eagerly awaiting the adoption. And you could think that Paul is defining that specifically, the redemption of our bodies, right?
Right.
Paul says that we were predestined unto the adoption. So in Ephesians 1:4, so you're looking, there's a forward aspect to this, but you also have the Spirit as the first fruits of all of those things. It's the same thing that Paul's on about in that super long sentence in Ephesians chapter 1 of the now but not yet. It's there in heaven waiting, but you have tastes of it. You have that down payment that
Right.
The spirit of adoption.
yeah, you have the spirit, the down payment, the whatever. You have that in the present, and to live in light of that, right? That's where all the imperatives of the book like Romans comes out of. And so, yeah, but what you were talking about, this familiar stuff, because it's not the framework, Junior, that we use, think about what gets lost in this. Because what has to be cast to the side, especially in the ecclesiastical discussions about does your church do church discipline, and why aren't you tossing people out and all this other stuff? Well, I mean, yeah, church discipline is very important. How do you do it? Do you do it like you fire somebody from employment, or do you do it like you would handle it in your
Right.
family, your children? Because what part of having the same familial language or familial kinship and lineage means that you are trying to preserve the honor of everyone else beyond yourself. And so for all of our talk about we want transparent, you know, you need to be honest and transparent, sure, but at the same time, insofar as you can, you want to preserve the honor of the family as a whole, even in light of the bad apples.
Right.
So, and it needs to be restorative rather than punitive, I think. And so, at least with the aim. Now, sometimes it's not always going to work out. That we live in a fallen world, and Christians can fall from grace. That, you know, that happens. But we always need to be aiming for miniature redemption arcs within our own family, because you want to see, if it was your sibling, like blood sibling, and you see them going through a trial, I want to see my brothers, or now brother, one passed away. I have a step brother and a younger brother. If they fall on hard times, or I fall on hard times, what they're looking is for my redemption arc. Like when I stray from what my mom raised me to do better, same with them or whatever. You want that redemption arc for your family. Whereas I see a lot of people in the church that they're praying for destruction of their brothers and sisters who are wayward, and not for the redemption of them. So in a familial context, you have to think about church discipline in that way. There cannot be patronage among family. That goes away too. This is, I mean, talk about Paul wanting money. You go to 1 Corinthians, you know, not many of you are of such standing, but that implies some of you are. You can use people in these, did we ever talk about like grace contests where people try to one up each other and all that to try to be the better patron? And I don't know if we talked about it. It gets into all kinds of stuff. But like, you can't have this kind of competitive. The ancient world is very agonistic, and it's very competitive for honor. It's competitive for status. It's limited goods, so everyone's competing for goods and stuff. But in a family, you can't have that, because you're trying to preserve the dignity of everyone and the success of the whole family, because they think more corporately than we do. We think individual. Well, as long as I got mine, it doesn't matter if my brother can't feed his kids because he fallen on hard times. I mean, no, that's unthinkable in the ancient world. Right. So do we think about all of our theological ideas, our theological debates, our in-church ecclesiological matters? Do we think that in terms of family or business? Anyway, Nick, I know you want to rant because I've been ranting forever. So correct every mess I made, and then add your 2 cents to what you think about this.
I don't have enough context to correct you, but everything you usually say needs a little of that. For we all know what good can come from Arkansas. But yeah, it's I don't know. I actually liked a lot of what y'all were saying. I think there's something to the passage as a whole that has this sort of, and it may just be because I preached on Revelation 12 on Sunday, and so we're talking about the pregnant woman, you know, travailing in agony, and the dragon, the ancient serpent, trying to eat the child and stuff like that. And it's
talk about apocalyptic.
Well, and that's where I'm just kind of chuckling. I'm like the imagery of pregnancy or expectation, or you might say pressure of sorts, or anticipation or longing, is very very overt in the passage, just as a whole. There is this very tense longing, almost desperation, that I don't know. It's the more I read the passage and reading it again and preaching on Revelation, the more I'm like, Paul is just very, very very focused on something that he has tasted, but is looking forward to the full meal of. And that's when y'all, I'm sure many of you know how this is, to go to bed hungry, knowing that there's a good breakfast in the morning waiting for you. That hits a little different than knowing you're hungry and you're going to wake up and there ain't no breakfast for you, And so here, I think if you take slavery, economics, hope, pregnancy, that sense of longing, that familial element, I think it's it's a very pastoral point that he's making, that we kind of, if I can use this term, we bastardize in terms of talking about predestination and election, when the whole image is about family and togetherness and love and corporate longing and corporate suffering together. That the burden you bear is in many ways my burden to bear with you. So there we go. Maybe that's a good word for it. The passage is very vulnerable and calls us to be very vulnerable with how we engage brothers and sisters, apocalyptically, we might say. So I don't know. That's been just listening to what y'all were saying. That's kind of my takeaway a little bit.
He says the same thing in Galatians, right? If anyone be taken in a fault, in chapter 6, restore such an one. Then he goes on to say, bear one another's burdens, and in this way fulfill the law of Christ. So again, it's that whole, not shame them, it's this family, to go with what you were saying, and then what JP was saying, it's still the bad apples of the family, so to speak, but you're still trying to retain the majority, the honor of the whole in that sense.
So it's kind of like Thanksgiving nowadays in America, where it should be a time of enjoying the familial aspect of it all, but we all get hung up around the dinner table over the debates.
Yeah, watching the Dallas Cowboys lose again. Yeah, that's usually how that goes.
So apopletai, debtors or whatever in this passage?
Obligation language, yeah.
Obligation language. Why that word? Because I'm looking at this in verse 12. Brothers and sisters, I know that you have this rant about inclusive language and all of that on the PowerPoint. Let me put that up.
Well, not about Adelphoi, but that'd be about techno, not Adelphoi.
Yeah, okay, but I'm just saying, so brothers and sisters, we are not obligated, or we're not debtors to the flesh. That's an interesting way to say that, because is this more of a reminder, or is this a statement that is it just reminding that they don't have to live a certain way, or is there an undercurrent of you're not going to live this way? Because I think that's going to play a key part in how people understand the next two verses that follow.
Well, I mean, Jesus uses the language of forgive us our debts, and we have also forgiven our debtors, and that's of course Matthew 6.
Is that the same language there?
Same lexeme, yeah. And okay. So let me, and then as he began, then a man who was owed 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. So that exorbitant Jeff Bezos times 10 levels of money. I'm wondering if it is better to not translate it, but to understand it in terms of debt slavery. That sort of being under the power of another, and using that economic image, which is already woven into, that's the heart of Paul's. I mean, Paul's asking for money basically, and then he decides to preach a sermon on top of it. So if you have that kind of, and I'm not saying the word should be translated this way, but understood in the sense of we're not under the bondage of wages to flesh, to that sort of idea. We're not captive to that economic substructure.
Yeah, so this is an indicative statement about the status of believers at the present. You don't have this, but then he goes on in verse 13. So I'm trying to see the relationship between, is this just like him reminding them of this? Because he says, but if you live according to the flesh, you are going to die. That sounds like a warning.
Well, Pritchett, freed people. So we know the language of one of the big debates in Paul and women, right? Is one of the reasons Paul kind of corrals certain women, let's say Corinthians,
Yeah.
is because when you give someone absolute freedom in Christ by the Spirit without proper guidance, you don't know what to do with it. And an example being Nolan. If I give Nolan 10 pounds of sugar, or I go with him and Derek to get donuts, and I give him 15 donuts and put, or no, I shouldn't even say it. I put 15 donuts in front of him. He's going to try and eat all 15 of them. And then what do you have from that? You have chaos, as he runs around behind me right now. And so I think here Paul is,
Oh yeah, at least he'd work off the donuts.
Well, exactly. But you have this sense of, here's the way you used to think. This is epistemology and ethics. You can't just separate the two. And I just have the ESV or the NIV. So therefore, brothers and sisters, we have an obligation, or we're indebted. We are not indebted to flesh to live according to it. But if you live according to the flesh, again, if you live according to the economic substructure of that reality, you will die. But if by the Spirit, So I think what Paul is trying to get them to understand is, just because you now have this declaration of freedom, of the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead and so on and so forth, you have this newfound freedom, but it's not to be lived under the shackles of the debt slavery that you previously existed in. So I think he's trying to get them to understand, yes, but don't, like Galatians, don't go back and assume that what you have now fits in that paradigm. This is new wine, not old wineskins.
So the pushback to the good Wesleyan Walls and Dongell, because they appeal to this verse, is like, well, Romans 31 through 39 you can't read it in such a way that ignores the very warning in this passage. But what people will push back on the once saved, always saved thing is say, this passage is giving an indicative statement about believers and then a descriptive statement about people who live in the flesh. But believers, of course, aren't going to do that. Now, I don't see of course, you're not going to do that.
That begs a whole host of questions. Let's talk about making the text say something the text is quiet about.
Well, obviously, you can't be unborn once you're born. That whole
let's get rhetoric from the Southern Baptists of 15 minutes ago rather than what the text said 2000. All right, cool. Yeah, we can do that.
But I mean, none of these things, death nor life, angels or rulers.
Here you go. If you live according to the flesh, you will die. But he means secretly in his heart of hearts, like a Calvinist, some people over here who It's like, no. If you, who are the same people, live according to the way you previously lived under that debt slavery, that debt slavery, you will die. You cannot mix, all these things together. What do you want?
So you do find an underlying prescription / warning passage in this text.
By implication, not necessarily by statements. The consequence of it would result in that. Well, how about you have some of Dad drink?
Well, they would push back to you and say then, well, Nick, I mean, but you're saying by implication, not by explicit. But what about these other passages? Why can't it be by implication? This is not referring to true Christians.
Name your passages, friends. We can go there. But as I see it, the text in front of me doesn't get you there.
Well, are you touching at all on 17? Is it 17? Hold on,
if children, then heirs of God, heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer or share in his sufferings.
I mean, is that a conditional statement there too on 17?
Well, because that reminds me of in Colossians 1, he says, if indeed you remain in the faith established and firm without shifting from the hope of the gospel. So whenever I hear if indeed, it sounds pretty conditional.
I see in like, I don't know if it's going way out of context here, but interwoven with Old Testament theology, right? Or even the ancient Eastern theology. So the blood rights, blood covenants, that's supposed to be like an ever binding thing, like a ever binding blood covenant. You violate that, you're out. So in the same sense as, we become heirs of God, we become heirs of Christ, and so on and so forth, and we're joined to Christ, we are, in Christ, so on and so forth. But then it's given statements like this. So it's like, what do we do with these statements?
You also have the issue too. Oh, I'm sorry. I hope I didn't.
No.
Verse 13, I think, has, depending on how you translate it, for if you live according to the flesh, then you will die. But if with this, and then this is, you don't have prepositions here, you have datives, so you have to supply a sort of preposition to understand it. But if I would say, the translation say by the Spirit, I would say probably something more like with the Spirit, because there's already agency within the passage. But if with the Spirit you put to death the misdeeds or the deeds of the body, you will live. So conditionality is woven throughout the entire passage, and it's a participatory or synergistic model. If you do this, you will live. And of course, death and life being antinomies, or I shouldn't even say that, these things they don't mix. Life is life, death is death. And so I wasn't even trying to talk about soteriological contingency, but I think the passage, verse 13, does basically remind the believer, like, if you live according to the old wineskins, they will burst and you will die and you will not be able to survive in this.
There's a comparison, like a negative then a positive in verse 13. If you live according to the flesh, and then if you with the spirit, so there's a negative and then a positive kind of comparison there.
Yeah,
and
the old realm.
Right, and then it puts responsibility then on the believers.
Yeah, you put to death is it active? It's you do this with the Spirit, or I would say, if we're being paraphrastic, if you do this in participation with the Spirit, you will live.
Right.
We don't get multiple different yous or persons in the passage here. You don't get, the people this or the people that. It's like, oh, they were never one of us. It's like, no, he's speaking to them as if they're all brothers and sisters, but brothers and sisters often, and we all have them, go wrong. I have a cousin who is, last I checked, is living under a bridge somewhere. So like, it's very possible for really bad things to happen to people of their own accord, or to be victimized and to go that route as well. So I think it kind of cheapens the passage to honestly make it about that, but I do think the passage speaks to it. And I'm not shaming you, Pritchett, because I know you and I've talked about this all the time. But just for people that basically want to do the predestination thing, I'm like, well, yes, but you're talking about a family unit engaging in holiness with the Spirit. There is conditionality, but there's also, I hate the language of assurance. I think it's a cheap term. But there is a sense of...
Whoa. No, wait.
Because it's a very loaded term that I now have to explain to you. When I could have just used a different term that I wouldn't have to explain. You're proving my point, Bridget.
Well, I don't know. I like assurance. I mean,
I like blessed assurance because I know
Paul
Jesus
gives us
is
assurance
mine.
here. If you put to death, if by the Spirit you put,
I'm assuring you're gonna die if you don't put this thing to death.
Right, but he's also assurance that if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. Now that's future oriented, but then it's present oriented for all those led by God's Spirit are God's sons. So, if that's descriptive of you. And so that's where I see that, the once saved, always saved, and I'm not a part of that team, but that's where I see that they would push back and say,
why are you carrying their water for them, Bridget? We don't have to. They're not here.
I know, but
but you're not going to.
I also want to limit the text that we use, because like Walls and Dongel, for example, people on our team appeal to this text, and I don't like using texts that don't necessarily go one way or the other. But I think there's data here. The you can't be different than the brothers and sisters he's speaking to.
Mm-hmm. He's speaking to the same group.
So I just want a better for my own benefit to be able to go, if this text is brought up, that it can stay a text in our column instead of the.
Well, we can add additional data here. 8:15. You did not receive, although it's in the active, it's active here, or so it'd be something more like accept or take. Receive often sounds passive or neutral, but here it's for you did not accept the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have accepted the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. So there is again additional acceptance, or you might say participational language here that might suggest. It's certainly, I'm not trying to make these massive claims. I'm making what I think are implications.
Do you think verse 9 comes into play from what we talked about last time? Because there's a condition there, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. So, kind of sets this up if we're going to be talking about conditionality and if statements in this context.
Well, one of the tricks that the once saved, always saved is, there you go again. This is a descriptive statement, and you're trying to turn it into a prescriptive statement.
Yes, Nolan?
And so I want to say that there's an implied prescription in every description. So I don't think that makes I think that's a distinction without much of a difference, because if you believe that means a person was never saved to begin with, fine, but it can also be a person who was saved who's no longer part of the covenant too. So it still applies either way as a underlying prescription to fit the description. And there's something to be done to fit the description anyway. So it's, I think all descriptions imply a prescription. So I don't know. But
It's there for a reason, right?
yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, this is not in case you notice somebody else. No, Paul's examine yourself to see if you're in the faith. You know.
So, verse 14, is that a general statement, or is for all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God? So that comes after like the warning.
Yeah, well, that's a matter of fact statement.
Right, yeah.
And then
Yeah.
is that you, right? That's the question.
Right.
Given everything you just said in 13, is that you?
Right.
And I think that I don't know where Derek is on this issue, but like
Derek's a Christian. He's with us.
right.
I'm just
of
a
the
Bible
opinion-
believer.
Kidding.
The Bible gives me enough to have. Sure, some people could have never been a part of us, and that's why they went out from us, and Jesus never knew them. That's fine. But there's also the ones that are cut off instead of abiding, the ones who have fallen from grace, or the Bible gives me a both and to that. I don't have to say for sure, well, they were obviously a Christian and then they stopped being one. Sometimes they may never have been one. I have both. I think the scripture gives me both of those options.
Well, but sometimes I will say that I feel like the whole, oh, they were just never truly saved can be a little convenient, you know?
It's used too much.
But yeah, because I think that doesn't explain. That could explain some. Like I said, the Bible gives me that option.
Yeah,
but it doesn't explain all of the data.
Well,
if I'm going to think that somebody was sincere, that an apostate was sincere, that he truly believed in Jesus and all this, to say that he never did that, when the Bible gives us plenty of reason to think that it's possible for you to fall from grace, to fall out of the faith, to apostatize. It's like saying, well, I can give the same skepticism to someone who professes to be a believer and say, yeah, I don't even think you're a Christian, dude. I don't care what you I don't care what Orthodox shibboleths you prattle off that you affirm. I don't think you're going to heaven with me, but
I get told that all the time.
Right. Well, yeah, and the people who typically call that enough are the ones that I call into question their profession of faith. I'm like, you're running around tossing everyone out of the kingdom but you. Maybe you're the one that's not a part of it because you don't understand the kingdom very well.
Yeah. Well, I just remember listening to a Paul Washer sermon one time, and he said, if a man faithfully served Christ in every way imaginable for 20 years and then spent the last year of his life living for himself and after his flesh, that 1 year is more proof he was never saved than the 20 years prior proved that he was saved. And I hear something like that, and I'm like, once again, it's awfully convenient. You're muted, Pritchett.
I was saying that's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. Because it could just be the case. Even people in the once saved, always saved camp. Dr. David Allen, for example, he would say that a person like that in his last year of life could have been on a trajectory to where God kills them so that they don't.
The sin unto death.
Yeah. So I know that's a very Southern Baptist way to do that. But I mean, that's where I get the little Chris Fisher and say, well, if God wants to kill them so that they don't apostatize, that's God's business. Because that's the equivalent of yanking your kid back from the running into the moving car. So I mean, I don't see why that could never happen. But
I mean, if Jesus killed children in the flood, I mean, what's to stop him from doing that? Right.
Well, exactly. So I don't put these caveats to try to solve a theological puzzle. I simply see it as an experiential one, and so God honors his promises to his corporate people, but as you as an individual, to be a recipient of that promise, you need to honor your patron in the ways that your patron has said it was appropriate for you to honor him. And that's to live a life of holiness and separation and to continue believing in all of that. So, I mean, I don't know. Go for it. I don't care if you're a Calvinist who believes in pots, go for it. If you're a Arminian or Provisionist who believes in OSAS, go for it. I don't care, but I just think you're wrong. Though I think that I think as far as building a bridge, I think that some of us conditional security types have more sympathies, I think, with the Calvinists, at least in the sense that this, no matter what you do, the kind of Tony Evans kind of, it doesn't matter how, even the Luther sin boldly kind of thing, like, doesn't matter how wicked you are or how much you say you don't believe in Jesus anymore. Once you're saved, it doesn't matter what you do. And I think that's a little too much into the, I know there's a term for that, but it's
like free grace,
I guess. Grace is free, but not cheap, and it's not easy. Grace is not opposed to effort. It's only opposed to earning. But there's that effort quality. That's an old Dallas Willard thing. But that's all I got on that. Anyone else want to, before we, it was interesting too, because I guess we'll get into the next section here. I think we already kind of covered this as well, 16 and 17. Was there anything else you wanted to add about that? This I kind of talked this to death about the Spirit testifying together with our spirit, that assurance language that Nick hates so much. But I mean, if you have that going on, but this idea of being an heir of God and a co-heir of Christ, pointing back to Romans 5 again about reigning in the new heavens and new earth as kings. Then there's that, if indeed we suffer with him, we may be glorified with him. And this is the glorified language here. And it's going to come up again next week. And this is just honor language. What's interesting, and I'll point this out next week, that for some reason when we get to verse 29 and 30, people will talk about foreknew, predestined, called, justified, glorified.
The unbreakable golden chain, right?
Sure. Call it whatever you want. But it's interesting that even clever commentators bungle this, because it's like, who does God foreknow? He foreknows persons. Who does he predestine? He predestines persons. Who does he call? He calls persons. Who does he justify? Justify persons. Who does he glorify? Bodies? No, he glorifies persons. What this idea? This passage talks about the redemption of our bodies, and sure, punt to 1 Corinthians 15. Yeah, there is a type of body that we receive, but that's not what's going on in this passage. I think this idea of glorification, that we may be glorified, highly honored and esteemed. This is honor language. This is not talking about you get a shell that's glorious to look at. I'm pretty close to one now. See what I did there? Theology Geek Fitness. You can look as good as me. Just kidding. Go subscribe anyway. Especially
not without some major plastic surgery, but okay.
Neck down, buddy. This is an old man face, but I've got the body of a Tom Welling from Smallville. I worked hard. I used to be really, really not this, so I own it. I'm proud of it. Hardest thing I ever did. But this is about glorifying people, holding them up in high esteem and honor, just whatever superlative way you want to say that, because he's just now finished saying heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. He's not talking about the shell you receive in the new heavens and new earth that, except for Nick Quint, the rest of us believe God puts your soul into. So this is more than this glorification language in Romans 8 is more than just about bodies. It's about status,
right?
It's about being. Yes, God doesn't share his glory with others. He gives you a glory of your own that he bestows. And it's for you. It's not just your body, it's for you. Yep. So I think that gets lost there.
Yeah, no, I got caught up on that a lot whenever I was trying to understand that passage. I was so pounded in my mind that about the glorification is when we receive our new bodies, that whenever I was reading that, I'm like, I just don't know what to do with the glorification there. And then it was actually Pritchett who made that case where he's like, it's not bodies. He glorifies people. This golden chain, if you want to call it that, is people. And then you read through Romans 8 again, and you see the full orb of glorification there, the familial language, the heirs, the adoption, and everything that comes with that you realize this isn't just purely a physical manifestation at the end of time, but
Right.
it is about honor and adoption.
I want to post this comment from BJ Allen. He says, because Junior, you had mentioned De Silva, and of course, Bruce Molina, Jerome Nere, a lot of the guys, I mean, you could throw Keener and Witherington. A lot of these guys in the, not so much Witherington, but a lot of these guys, they're conservative, moderate, liberal, theologically, all over the spectrum. What came out of the Jesus seminar was this group called the Context Group, and they were, it was a more balanced thing because like Nere was in there, and some of those guys. I think De Silva was a part of it for a while. I don't think they're still around, but they kind of grew out of that, and it was more balanced than the Jesus seminar was just overwhelmingly liberal scholars, right? But this Context Group kind of formed a little bit after that because what they were interested in was studying the New Testament in light of sociological insights from the social sciences and anthropological type data and applying that. And they call themselves a context group because they were reading the New Testament in light of that. And then you see some people hop on board of that, and you see these socio-rhetorical commentaries. And there's a whole methodology to that Ben Witherington doesn't really actually follow in his socio kind of misnamed commentaries. But there's an actual Vernon K. Robbins came up with a methodology for what he calls socio-rhetorical commentary. But social science commentaries became the thing. And I'm telling you, when you read guys that were these context scholars, and then you can throw Barclay. I think Nick named his cat after John Barclay, but I don't know if he still has Barclay. He's not listening. You still have Barclay. Okay, good. And some of these guys, they kind of take this social science approach and rhetorical approach to the New Testament. And if you learn that stuff, you don't have to read as many Pauline commentaries and books as Nick Quitt does to understand what Paul's going. You can understand the entire New Testament with very little help just because you read that kind of material and you start applying it consistently, line by line, verse by verse, pericope by pericope, and it makes it a lot easier. And if you study Peter and James and the epistles, you will rightly understand everything Paul says because Paul can't be in conflict with any of them, and then you don't have to get lost in the mud of Pauline scholarship. There you go. Study the social science backgrounds to the New Testament.
Well, yeah, even and that's some good stuff. And I got this from I think L. Flowers, and even he mentions in his video, he's like, even Jonathan Pritchard agrees with me. So that was kind of funny. But same thing with what Derek was saying. Like I got caught up with the glorification because of systematic theology. So I'm just so used to glorifying bodies. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Thessalonians 4. Philippians, wherever that is, transform our vile bodies, 2 Corinthians 5, if our KJV, earthen tabernacles or tents were to dissolve. So this whole glorification language in Romans 8, to whom we justify, so on and so forth. But then, again, taking into account what Paul has been saying up until now, yes, there is a element of glorification of our bodies or however, or a redemption of our bodies, rather, right? Yep. The kind of word that he uses, the redemption of our bodies. But when he talks about glorification in the sense of familial and honor and status, that just seems to flow much better. And a cross-reference that can, Revelations, he that overcomes, I will give him a new name type of thing, right? And kind of what Paul is saying here, in some sense, is this: don't live according to the flesh, live according to the spirit, because that's, the familial aspect comes in. If you live according to the spirit, we are children of God. And then it's talking about this familial adoption, heirs, we are heirs of God, joint heirs with Christ. So glorification in the sense of honor and status, I think you mentioned earlier, which is actually David D. Silver again, the different types of honor, right? Acquired, ascribed, and so on and so forth. We receive glorification in the sense of status and going into that economic structure. So that just fits better than
right
body thing. Yeah.
And it's the slavery comes back up again. This debtor obligation language comes back up again. Inheritance language is both kinship language and yes, once again, as Nick points out in the PowerPoint, is economic language again. Toss that in with works and wages and all that. I mean, Paul's Paul's all about
Right.
economics and money in this letter, but I mean, it's all this economic metaphors. You got that in the
All about the
stuff that we
Benjamins.
talked about. Yeah.
The
All
Caesars.
about the Caesars, right? It was
Caesars.
Caesars, the coins is all about the Caesars. He was trying to get that Caesar money. Christ is Lord. Sedition is trying to get that Caesar money. God bless Paul. But yeah, so you've got that going on in these passages and this heirs and adoption, the economic reality. I like this excellent phrase here. The heirs denotes the economic reality of God's gracious economy.
Mm-hmm.
Well stated. Well stated. I couldn't do better. Now, he haggles over these words down here about suffering with and co-glorification. I think you already hit it on that, Nick, about talking about it's participatory, is synergistic. Paul just assumes this. What did you have? I would like to know more about this this idea of co-glorification, because it is I guess it is synergistic in the sense of that we suffer with him, so that we may be glorified together. What that's a big word for my student Doxus Thoman. We may be glorified together. Is that a good way of saying that? So I think of that, our sufferings with Jesus, and then our co-glorification is among the fellow believers with Jesus. Is how I would read that. But to me, there's a chain there. I see the chain there in verse 17. Going back to the PowerPoint. Is conditional that the former leads to the latter, right? So,
right.
And if children, that means we have this, we have this honor rating of this ascribed honor. We have this inheritance with Christ. But then he goes into that statement, if indeed we suffer with him so that we may be glorified with him, we all are glorified together with Christ on account of suffering with him. And so that kind of guarantees the Christian life suffering, which leads us directly into verse 18, because what Paul's saying here is, going back to chapter 5, is you're going to have these hardships. These hardships have a goal, a telos to them, and if you suffer with Christ, though, you also will be glorified with Christ.
So with that glorification aspect, then, if we're talking about status and bestowing, I see Philippians 2 linked into this.
Yeah.
Right? Death of the cross. After his death on the cross, whereby God had highly exalted him, right? Giving him a name and so on and so forth. So what Paul, could be alluded to here is our participation, or due to our union with Christ, since we are heirs, joint heirs and children, if we suffer with Christ. So again, Christ is always used as the what's the phrase or word I'm trying to the focal point, right? Christ suffered, because we can go back to the chapter 1 where Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, because that is the power of God in salvation. Well, what does that word carry? Shame, right? And disgrace. Because imagine preaching Christ as Lord, and as soon as you remember Jesus Christ, what are they going to remember? This glorified rabbi, or this dude that was strung upon the cross and stripped naked? So, so where Paul is preaching now, what? Our glorification, Christ has been glorified. And if we suffer with him, we too will be glorified. So it's that, again, honor and bestowing, and because of our heir and lineage.
Yeah, yes. And Braxton is also typing and commenting under this. I said I didn't make that comment about this statement. That was the bald one, and then he says, as opposed to the balding one. I noticed that when I'm on this stream and I'm looking at myself, I notice the hairline is in full retreat and it's thinning out. And I will catch up with my esteemed co-host partner soon enough. One of the things about this idea, it's coming. But I'm reminded, Junior, of Philippians 2, that after he had humbled himself, even unto death on a cross, the very next line is highly exalted, the exaltation. And then, so that is a pre-Pauline hymn that he uses there in Philippians 2. I don't know much about Paul. I know that much. But I hear an echo of that because we also are going to be glorified with him together, all of us believers with Christ as co-heirs and stuff. So if Christ's sufferings, if we suffer along with him, which guarantees the Christian life to have some suffering,
right?
I mean, we don't have to compete with Jesus or even the early church fathers, but there's going to be trials and hardships.
Right.
And by the way, one way that you can suffer, even if your life is easy, is if you're a person of means and you're thinking that my life is a little too comfortable. Well, every time a youth pastor breaks his leg and he doesn't have health insurance, like the one that appears here from time to time, for doing things he ought not do at his age, and he's younger than me, maybe give a little bit to stuff like that, Maybe if your life is so comfortable that you're not experiencing suffering, let go of some of the things that are bringing you comfort so that you can be a blessing to others and see what it's like to not have, even though you made it yourself. There's nothing wrong with that either.
Real quick, I was going to say that I also see echoes of Colossians 1 in here as well. I think it's verse 21 where he says that you were at one time strangers and enemies in your minds as expressed through your evil deeds, but now he has reconciled you by his physical body through death to present you holy, without blemish, and blameless before him, which sounds a lot like Ephesians 1. Mm-hmm. And then he immediately goes into the if indeed you remain in the faith. So I think you have that language right here in Romans 8 as well, where he's talking about you have the glorification language, but you also have the conditionals that go along with it as well.
Yeah, conditional statements I typically read as legitimately conditional.
They're just theoretical.
But then again, it's still, I mean, you can kind of say, yeah, it's conditioned, but it's still descriptive and not prescriptive. I mean, you can make that case, but I'm like, yeah. So, but if that's also, there's an implied prescription here that has, you have to do something so that is the case, because Paul did say, but if by the Spirit not if the Spirit puts to death, but if by that empowering presence, you do it. That's an obligation. That's something that requires you to act. And
well, I'm just naturally kind of skeptical of interpretations that look like they are trying to work their way to a foregone conclusion rather than pull out of the text. So if somebody, it's just descriptive, it's like, well, it sounds like kind of special pleading to me. But
yeah, I'm like, well, if that is not descriptive of you, then what are you going to do about it? Mm-hmm. But that gets into the theological question that, I mean, if you're a Calvinist, well, you can't unless, you're determined to, right? So, that's a problem too. But this is whether it's descriptive or prescriptive, or it's descriptive with an implied prescription, I say you always go with the latter, because this is participatory and God set it up to where you do stuff. I don't know why we're so afraid we don't want to add to the work of Christ. You're not adding anything to what Christ did. You're adding your part to live out the Spirit-filled life that you're called to. That has nothing to do with adding to what Jesus did on the cross. It has nothing to do with adding to what God's doing for you in and through the Spirit. It's you participating with that. God didn't have to give you a spirit, but he did. And that spirit can groan, and you can quench that spirit, or you can groan along with it. I don't get this. I mean, why are we? It's like so much of evangelicalism is a slave to Luther. It's obnoxious.
Well, yeah, it's really easy to just throw everything into the works-based salvation category that maybe strikes you a little odd whenever you talk too much about the effort that we make, the choices we make in the process.
Yeah, and that goes back to where I know we were dunking on Paul Washer earlier, and especially me, because I thought what he said was kind of dumb. But he does talk a lot. I used to listen to him semi-regularly. I mean, he's an old guy now. He's up there, he's even older than I am. He's been around for a while. And some of the things that I like, he would get accused of being, work salvation sometimes. But that's where I'm like right along with him. I'm like, yeah, you gotta do this.
He's really good with the examine yourself stuff.
Right. Which implies if you find yourself lacking, you can't just wait, for something to happen. You have to make things happen.
Yeah,
God has gifted you with the tools that you just kind of put away in your toolbox and never pull them out.
Well, most Christians are okay with saying we have a choice in the matter. We have to make the right choice. But even if you're a Calvinist, it's like, well, you have the illusion of choice, or however you want to parse it. So either way, just in your conscious mind, make the choice that you're going to pursue obedience and holiness and faithfulness to God.
Yeah. Well, they'll say, oh, we're flattening it out. Well, I've never seen anyone inflate it to my satisfaction. So it's still a flat tire that they blow a lot of hot air into to try to make it run on the car. But I haven't heard it. You can call it decretalism, compatibilism, whatever you want to call it. It's not working. But hey, we all have a tradition, I guess. Right. I love this section here. We just talked about the glorification, and and Paul comes back with the assurance business that Nick doesn't like, because he's like, because one of the things he's trying, this is the sales pitch of the passage, right? He says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is going to be revealed to us." Right? That's him trying to sell this, so to speak, right? He's like, all of this stuff that we deal with, it pays off because it has a purpose, and then we're going to be heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. We're going to be glorified, and so everything that we're putting up with now is not worth comparing to what is coming. Now, granted, the Bible doesn't really say a whole lot about what's coming, and I'm not one to subscribe to heaven tourism stories. So
I think they're great.
You like them?
I like them for the comic, but yeah, I don't subscribe to them at all. But yeah.
For the comic relief. Okay, so we don't have much beyond metaphor and revelation and other flickers of things. We just know that it's going to be good. And Paul's like, even though he's slack on the details, he's trying to make this. It's like, it's not even, all of this bad stuff is not even worth comparing to what's coming.
Right.
But for us Christians who are already sold on the glorification of Christ and the ascension of Christ to the right hand of the Father and all of that, we know that, he's crushing enemies left and right. A lot of awesome stuff going on there. Once you've bought into that, it's easy to say, yeah, in light of eternity of that with God as an heir of God and co-heir with Christ, and yes, even though in the glorified bodies, the heavenly bodies as opposed to these carcasses, it's like, yeah, you can get on board with that. But it keeps going. He's like, the creation eagerly awaits with anticipation for the sons and daughters of God to be revealed, right? This trips up everybody. What is that weird Mother Earth religion thing that the Earth is a conscious being type stuff?
Gaia?
Gaia, yeah.
Like Greek mythology.
Yeah. That's not what's going on here. But I could see, it's metaphorical language, but I could see Paul appealing to this kind of thing. This idea, this anthropomorphizing creation, right? Because if you're thinking about creation, we know that Paul goes back to the beginning of creation in chapter 1, right? We know he speaks of Adam in chapter 5. So we know that he has all this, and he sees that the vocation language of the image, right? To steward
the
creation, to name and subjugate and have dominion over the animals, But then there was the fall. And so we've made a complete mess of our vocation. We have tarnished that image because we are living, breathing images. We are the icons. We're about to be told we're being being fashioned to the icon of Christ. We are the icons of the temple, not the dead things that represent the God, but we are the image bearers of the deity, not the statue in the thing. We're living, breathing beings, right? And we are the image bearers that are in the temple, that are the cosmic temple, to try to, steward it, and made a complete mess of it, And so the image being painted here is, it's waiting on us, right? And whatever agency you want to give to animals, and I probably give too much to some animals, because we did a whole thing on Trinity Radio about I believe that pets will be in heaven, and that causes a kerfluffle with a lot of people. And I'm like, why does God not want to? I mean, those animals died because of human beings. Why, those animals know God, Job 12, right? The animals, Jesus talks about animals a lot. Creation knows God better than animals know better than most image bearers know God, right? So why not? I don't have a verse for it. It's kind of an inference from other verses. I have no explicit statements. I don't bind anyone's conscience to it, but I won't have any of this, oh, you're a bad Christian because you believe that your dog will be in heaven with you either. All dogs go to heaven. We know that, not cats. But I mean, I have no problem believing that pets are in heaven, and we've talked about that on other things. But what you get the sense of is that all of this creation that human beings were to be given dominion over, it's waiting on the revelation of us, I guess, in our final form, so to speak, when we reach peak image bearing, because when we're finally there, because it has been subjected to futility. And Nick raises the question on the PowerPoint for you. He's like, here, deal with this mess. And then he runs off, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. He was raptured.
Yeah, he says calling it a divine passive doesn't solve anything. Well, I don't know. Who subjected creation? Well, I'm going to say that God did, not Adam, because God cursed the ground. And that's the closest thing that I have. But then again, after the flood, he's like, I'm not going to curse the ground anymore. But that doesn't mean that that undoes the first one. It's just it's not going to be worse, right? That's kind of how I think. There's other ways you can hash that out. So I don't really care. But he's not here to say Adam or Christ or the devil. But what we know is that creation was subjected, and it was not willingly, but of him who subjected it. But because it was subjected to futility in the hope that creation itself will be set free from the bondage of decay into the glorious freedom of us, right? I'm going to go with God. And I know that sounds like a raw deal for creation, but creation's holding it against us.
Yep. It's all trying to kill us.
Yeah. While it waits. So it's like, yeah, okay, you're not going to steward. Well, this is not going to work out for you either, because God lets, and Braxton and I were having a conversation about climate change in general, because they were doing shows on Trinity Radio about Gavin Ortland and Megan Basham and some controversy. I've watched a little bit of those videos, but I lost interest. Not because Chris Date and Braxton aren't riveting. They are. The subject thing. But we were talking about global warming in general. And I don't know what to think about that, because I'm not a scientist. So I don't want to get into that. But one of the things that I was thinking about, and I've said this on Trinity Radio before, whatever you believe about global warming or climate change or any of that, whatever you believe about that. If the consensus of science says our behavior, human behavior, is doing bad things to the planet, okay, well, like the doomsday scenarios have never came true, but so I'm worried about the planet warming 1 degree every 150, 200 years. Okay, yeah. I mean, that's not great, but that's not like end of the world either. And I'm not going to stop using air conditioning and driving my car for 1 degree a century or whatever. But yeah, I have no doubt, just because my environmentalism, I care more about like the pollution I can see rather than the warming that, it's August and it's in the 80s in Indiana of all places, where right by the Ohio, it's usually 100 degrees. So I'm not complaining about that. Temperatures rise, whatever. But yeah, I have no problem in theory that climate change something like that's happening. We're affecting the environment because we infect these people that make the Ohio River that's outside my window the most disgusting river in the country. I see the crap they put in there. That bothers me. People who litter bother me. You know, I'm more about cleaning up trash rather than taxing cow farts. But so that's where my environmentalism is. I want to be a good steward. I want people to clean up after themselves. But just supposing that climate change is true, and even throw in the worst doomsday, well, as an apologetic point, when you talk about the problem of evil, people say, okay, well, the free will defense handles why human beings are bad, but it doesn't handle what happens in natural evil, what happens in nature. You know, a burning branch falls on a deer and burns it alive, and that's awful. Okay, well, every hurricane season for the past 5 years, I hear they always rope in global warming. So I always tell people I love climate change, love it, because if I'm talking to someone who's not a Christian and they're bringing up the problem of evil and they bring up natural evil and I bring up climate change, and this is why I love it, because the second they concede that human behavior affects the climate, that our free will decisions, poor as they may be, affect the environment, you've lost your argument.
Right.
Because you believe in principle that a free will act of whether it's Adam or all collective humanity or whatever, you believe in principle that our free will decisions have an impact on the natural world.
Right.
And the natural evil from earthquakes and forest fires and everything else. And so once you admit that you believe in climate change or whatever, you've conceded that point too. The free will defense handles moral evil of humans and natural evil. So I love climate change, if for no other reason than it takes away that little pushback. Well, natural evil, though. Well, no, you agree that human beings, and you know why that happens? Because human beings in the very beginning were given dominion over the planet, and this is what the fallen world does. So you need to get with the Bible, because the Bible predicted this long ago. So again, you don't have to believe one single word. Climate hoax. That you're a climate hoax guy. Listen to what I'm saying. You don't have to believe it to make the argument I'm making. Okay. Yeah, well, if you're this guy, HWD71, climate change is hooey. Who cares? When you're discussing the problem of evil and the role of human beings in creation, climate change, that hooey becomes your best friend in that conversation, because it puts your opponent in a very, very awkward situation to where they have to become the science denier to cling on to their defeater for the problem of evil theodicy for the free will defense. Right. So I love climate change. So there you go. That's a little bit of apologetics for you.
What I'll say very quickly is so going back to what you said first, you know, how Paul kind of teases out what is expected of or the hope that Christians have, right? He never fully says it, but he's just, the sufferings of the present time is not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Well, what's it like? And he doesn't say anything for the creature or something, so he doesn't actually get into what what awaits us. And I was going to cross-reference he just kind of teases it. I wanted to cross-reference 1 John, where John says, it does not yet appear what we shall be. He says, but when he shall appear, we will be like him, for we shall see him as he is. So he, again, it's like this. It's an anticipation, but this teasing, never fully describing, but kind of just wait and see type of thing that you have them saying. So it's kind of genius, because Paul says the same thing as John said. In Romans here in this chapter, he's like, if you through the Spirit do mortify the deeds of the body. So again, it's that living holy, living pure. And then he mentions the suffering is not worthy to be compared because of something that's coming. John says the same thing. It does not yet appear what we shall be, but when we see him, we'll be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Therefore, keep yourself pure. So they're kind of saying the same thing. Look, live holy and expect something great type of thing to come. So I like that that kind of cross-reference. And what you're saying as well, that's actually a good climate change argument. I might have to look into that and kind of adopt that argument for myself. That's actually brilliant. That's genius.
Yeah. Just one of those things that it occurred to me that whatever you make of it, it kind of concedes the point that's.
Right.
But see, even in this passage, though, Paul is bringing us back to this vocational language of Genesis, which is why I'm fine with this idea of God being the one who's rejected it. He cursed the ground in response to Adam, said, "You're going to toil harder." And then maybe I'm overloading that with more of natural evils than maybe the text was intended to carry. But we know that Paul's saying it's groaning. There is natural evil, so you can. But again, I reason from the scriptures. So the scriptures can I can reason from it. Why are bad things happening? Why are these? God said He's never going to flood and wipe out all of humanity, but there's still floods that wipe out a good deal of humanity.
Right.
Why is Earth irritated? But it's a fallen world. We live in a fallen cosmos, and this goes back to you had mentioned 21 at the top of the hour. Derek, you're talking about creation itself will also be free from the bondage to decay and the glorious freedom of God's children. Young Earth creationists and old Earth creationists, this verse I think does come up in that debate because
It does.
I have a lot of old Earth friends who try to say that God built knowing that the fall was going to occur. Even the non-Calvinists would say God knowing that Adam was going to fall. Outside of the garden, just built in, when that came along, when the garden came along, what someone like IP, though he's more than an old Earth, he's a theistic evolution. He would say when God elected Adam, he'd say the fall was built into the creation, so it was an old Earth, and there were already animal deaths and stuff outside of the garden because of that. I've already admitted I'm a don't care creationist. I have no idea. I have no dog in that fight. I see the old Earth creationists are trying to do the same thing as the young Earth creationists, try to get their science to fit the text. But I think this is a terrible argument for old Earth creationism. and I'm probably more sympathetic. I mean, I don't care, but if you had to pin me down, 51-49, but I lean old Earth. Insofar as I care, which is almost none,
right?
But I think this is this idea of it was this bondage was built in to the model, right? And so I'm not keen on that argument from the old Earth creationists.
Well, so the way that I kind of fell on this because I was really involved in that debate, in years past. So this very much did come up and. There were young Earth creationists who would say the creation was subjected to futility. They say Adam sinned and therefore God introduced entropy into the universe. And I think that's the concordism, trying to fit the scripture into a scientific paradigm that Paul wasn't actually trying to put it in. Plus, I don't think it makes any sense to say there was no entropy before the fall because entropy is not what most people think it is. You can't have heat flow, you can't have digestion or nuclear reactions in the stars without entropy. So I wouldn't go that far for sure. But kind of where I landed on it was the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. I think that goes back to the Genesis 1 commission to have dominion and to reign over the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, to subjugate the creation. And so that was lost through the fall. So I could still I don't have a definite answer to who subjected it. I'm okay with saying it could have been God whenever he made the curses in reaction to sin, but that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. The whole creation groans and suffers in pains, childbirth, and together until now. So kind of the way I saw it is that God in Genesis is basically, and this can fit into several different interpretive paradigms, but he is ordering the chaos of the universe throughout Genesis 1. Then he gets to mankind, the pinnacle of his creation, and he says, you are going to take part in this ordering the chaos along with me. Your commission is to have dominion and subjugate the creation, the plants, the ground, the animals. You're going to have dominion over all that. We sin, creation is left to essentially decay instead of us taking dominion over it and, subjugating it, it's kind of going wild because we're not fulfilling our commission as we were appointed initially in like Genesis 1 in the creation. And so then whenever in the eschaton, the revelation of the sons of God, that is when we are glorified, and you have the eschaton where we essentially come back to fulfill that commission to subjugate and have dominion over the creation. It's the new heavens, the new earth. Somewhere along those lines is where I kind of saw it.
Yeah, and I know that there's also some debates within that some people will push back and say that, well, the whole creation, this word creation itself will also be. Some people say, well, that's talking about in a lot of these, for the creation eagerly awaits. Some people say that's the creature, not creation.
I think that, does the King James translate it that way?
I can't remember, but there's a discussion about that and a debate like that throws them.
Yeah, I've heard that.
I have never, ever been. I mean, I know we don't want to be like Gaia, like that. This is anthropomorphic language, but I think that there's a reality to it that we see expressions of nature's groanings in like natural disasters or whatever. But I don't see this as being the I think Paul's talking about cosmos here.
Oh yeah, no, it was the KJV. It says, for the creature in verse 20 was made subject to vanity.
Yeah, I'm not sold on that. I think it's creation, all of it, the total sum of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know enough about those who want to shill for the creature reading because I never found it convincing enough to care what their arguments were. Because this seems to be Paul talking about creation itself, because it ties it so well back to Romans 1 and the decline. And then here it is, it's on the rebound in this kind of anticipation of freedom itself, under the wise guidance of glorified image bearers, returning to the original vocation.
Yeah, it looks like it's a few old translations that say creature, so I'm going to guess it's not well attested to.
So 24 and 25, now in this hope we were saved, but hope that is not seen is not hope, because who hopes for what he sees? That's an interesting line, but I think it's misunderstood. What Paul's just saying is we don't have this now, but I think Paul would affirm the glimpses of the already in that which is not yet, or otherwise this argument falls on its face. And so when Paul uses words like hope, and if you go to the author of Hebrews, faith.
I was just thinking that,
the things hoped for, the
11:1.
things I've seen. People misunderstand that as well, because faith itself is based upon past performance, and the whole reason why you can hope, though, the only reason why you can hope is for things that you can't see is based on the things that you can, right? And the evidence and testimony of past performance plays into future expectation, which gives birth to the hope in the first place. So the fact that we can't see this hope, because you wouldn't have to hope for it. But the only reason you do hope for it is because you believe it'll happen based on what has happened, right? So I always got to remind people of that, because they say this, who hopes for what he can see? So there's nothing blind here just because of the way he's talking about it. He's just making an emphatic point that if we had it in the now, we wouldn't be hoping for it.
Mm-hmm.
But based upon what we have as a spirit, as the first fruits, we have the evidence that we can hope for the things that we can't see based upon the things that we experience in the present, including the sufferings. Mm-hmm. So that's what's going on there. I know it seems a little bit weird, but it was this hope that we were saved, but who hopes for what he sees? Well, you can't see this thing that he's selling us on, the glory that is to come, which means everything we're dealing with now is not worthy to compare. Why is it not? Because even in the midst of our suffering now that has a purpose, that God is taking care of us, the Spirit is groaning, we're groaning, everyone's groaning, we're all groaning. But it's like there's still reason to hope at all based upon what you've experienced now gives you the reasons and basis to hope for the things that you can't see yet.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a blind thing that Paul's talking about here.
Yeah, just kind of the way that I thought of it is like to see it. I don't know. I kind of had John 3 in my mind about but nobody can see the kingdom of God unless they've been born again. So it's like there's something behind the sea. Like it's not there. Like you're not seeing it yet, but it doesn't mean like there's no evidence of it. Right. Or like maybe you could say the seeing through a glass darkly kind of thing.
Yeah, the whole point is that it actually is. It makes no sense unless it is evidence based, because he says, now if we are doing this, now if we do hope for what we don't see, we eagerly await for it with perseverance. Some people translate that patience. I like the perseverance thing because it's more active, it's more determined, it's more. Patience, I don't think is a good translation at all, anyway. But I think the context here is we eagerly await with perseverance, with more active fortitude, not with like, I can wait.
Yeah.
The point is not that you can wait on it. The point is that you're going to be intentional and that you're going to be fortified as you anticipate this kind of thing.
Yeah, kind of like the whole thing about active waiting.
Yeah.
Where you're actually doing something in the meantime, stewarding something until that comes.
Yeah, I think he was going to make some hay about determinism again, but no need. All right, so rubber meets the road. This is the best part of the show, and so it's going to be up to the two of us to deliver all the goods for any pastors who's trying to do sermon prep and wants some practical application. But I agree with what he's posting up here. The Holy Spirit is the principal agent. That can be underscored enough because, the Spirit is introduced in chapter 5, other than the introduction, however you understand the spirit of holiness and the epistolary opening in chapter 1. But like the Spirit comes into full view here, with the Spirit groaning, all of that good stuff. Next week, talking about the Spirit's intercession for us, So the Holy Spirit, I like that. You talk about the Holy Spirit. How do we live in this world? That's a good question. Yeah. So where are you at with this? And then I'll give my thoughts.
Are you saying like practically, pastorally?
Right.
Okay. Yeah. So this week I didn't prep, so I don't have anything written down. So just kind of fly through this. I like that he emphasizes the Spirit because it's all over verses 12 through 17, talking about like adoption but by the Spirit you're putting to death the deeds of the body, you will live. I would get into that, and I would set up because I like what you say about perseverance in verse 25. Like I think that all goes together, and then talk about adoption. The economic language that we talked about, the familial language behind this, kind of leading up to verse 18. And then, because that's one of those comfort passages, so that's something that I like to touch on in any sort of pastoral ministering context is that, this world really sucks right now. We all see it. We've been asking about it and wondering about it and, fighting with it since the beginning of time about all the suffering in the world. But, Paul is using this. Chapter 8 is such a hopeful chapter. And I think that it really climaxes whenever he talks about glorification more explicitly. But the glorification language I would get into about all this, and, because you have the word hope throughout that, I would talk about how you could do a word study through the New Testament of the word hope and see how much the New Testament talks about hope, what we're looking forward to, the things that are yet to come. There's actually a lot to say. Now, it doesn't get specific on exactly what that looks like, but that there is a great hope we have. I would talk about what we were just talking about with the creation, awaiting the revelation of the sons of God. I think of Colossians 3:4. your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you too will be revealed in glory with him. So I think that this is participatory, that this is something that, is driven by the Spirit in Christ, that we're going to take part in this, and that in the end of all this, that we are hoping for, we are going to have a role. We're going to be heirs through adoption. And then let's see if I had anything else. I really like verse 26 with the Spirit there, but that we'll leave that for next week. So,
yeah. So I think that a good way to frame this, if I was teaching it, is suffering as family in the Spirit and hoping as family in the Spirit, right? Mm-hmm. So those would be the big themes that you have: family, you have in the Spirit, and then you have hope, and you have the Spirit. And this is I would highlight the kinship aspects of us as family, kind of bonded together. And I don't mind going to other Pauline passages, 1 Corinthians 3 and 1 Corinthians 6, you've got individuals as the temple and you have the corporate body as the temple, mm-hmm. right? But here you have all of us as family. And so I would suffering as family in the Spirit, and I would highlight hoping as family in the Spirit, and tease out all of these things that do remind us about what our original vocation is in light of a groaning creation, right? What are we to do? Peter's better at this than Paul. Okay, so Peter sees us as a nation of priests. Well, our priestly vocation is to harness the praises of creation and offer them back to God. Mm-hmm. Paul is as we offer ourselves as sacrifices to God, and Paul's good on that, where Peter's probably not as good. But Peter's really good about reminding us of gathering all the creation as a kingdom of priests and offering our living sacrifices in that way. And so I would obviously rope Peter in to help complete Paul, because Peter's awesome. And so I'd go there for help, but I would bring out those aspects. I would explain the whole reality of kinship here. I would not ignore the warnings that are in this passage as I understand this passage, right? Because wherever you are on that debate of once saved, always saved, or eternal security or conditional security or whatever, it's a good reminder to the church that Paul gives here either way, that this needs to be what you're about, right? In the midst of the creation that's groaning all around us, and that we're going to groan and the Spirit's going to intercede with inexplicable groanings. We get to that next week. All of that's going on. I might, like you, save my comments for that next week, but I'd probably start from 12 and go all the way through to 27. But that's just me. If I was teaching or preaching, I'm long-winded, so I'd make them sit there. Probably would think I'd never shut up, except for super chat $100, and I'll mute my own mic. Mm-hmm. Braxton here to do it. Give me $100.
Standing offer.
That's right. Always offering that. So I would bring up those themes, the suffering as family in the Spirit, and then what we're to do vocationally. I don't mind getting into ecological theology here, because Paul's referencing creation. We know the original creation mandate: be good stewards, wise stewards of what we can do. So that's kind of where I would go with this passage. And then I would highlight the hope and what, even though the Bible doesn't give us the clearest picture of what the new heavens and earth are going to be like, we can trust Paul to know that it'll be way better than this, and it's not going to be worthy of comparing the two. So in the meantime, knowing that the best is yet to come, let's do what we can in the present now, while creation is groaning to do our priestly vocation as image bearers, because we have been given that we are family, we are co-heirs with Christ, we are heirs of God. That means we have a new ascribed honor status. We need to live in worthy of that status by the Spirit. So that's where I'm at on that. Before we go, I want to get to Jamie Russell, a dear mod of the channel. Had a couple of things that I starred. Do you think the revealing is the resurrection? Yes. When Jesus returns, absolutely.
Yep.
Don't see any other way to read this passage. And then he also says, so we are confident knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. Absolutely. So I see it as like the expectation based upon past performance is how I understand that. And given my understanding of hope for the things not seen based upon the things that we have seen, right? And the evidence of the life experiences that we're having now in the spirit, we can have that hope. And, Paul says a lot of things that, I wish I had the way to say it. As good as he does when he talks about, to depart, and be with Christ is far better. Sure, I'm not ready to go though. I wish I had that level, of willingness to die. I guess. I don't have that, to be honest with people. I still think that, and part of it's because I still think I have things that God wants me to do, but I also have things that I want to do, and I don't mind admitting that. I wish I had that level of confidence. I do have a high level of confidence. So if I were to get hit by a car on the way home, it'll be fine. But I just hope not.
Yeah.
I hope not. I do want to get home to my wife. And
exactly.
Still got Noah in the house and hang out with Noah. Not ready to let go of all that. But yeah, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, and that would be much better. But even better than that is to be in that body that Paul talks about a few chapters later in chapter 15 in the new heavenly body instead of this perishable, corruptible one. So,
yep.
Those are my thoughts on that.
I like what Irenic Pelagian says, because it's kind of what I was getting at. The perseverance better matches the struggle, apparently.
Oh, yeah.
Because we have this hope, but we're not just simply waiting around for it. We are actually striving and persevering unto that hope.
Yeah, amen. And he also added, we need to persevere in the now, groaning creation, basically with the hope for all the resurrection beings. Yes. And I don't care what they say about you on the internet, IP. You are one of those that will be resurrected. You will not be consigned to the flames with your namesake, Pelagius. All right, folks. Derek, you before we go, I'm going to give you a plug. You uploaded a new video. You, like me, were fat, and you lost a lot of weight, and you reflect. And I haven't watched the video. I'm gleaning from the title. It's in my watch later list. That you were reflecting on the things that you do the same and things that you do different.
Yep. Because, I mean, going from my heaviest to my goal body weight took a little over 4 years. So that's not ideal. So there's definitely plenty to learn, like mistakes to learn from. But there were things that I'm like, this was the right thing to do. So
I did a similar video. I don't know if it's out yet, of what I do differently, what I do the same. I've recorded all my Theology Geek Fitness videos through like the end of November, I think, and then I have some yearly ones that I have to wait until the time at the end of the year to record then. But I don't, so I don't know if it's out yet, but I did the same thing, and it may be out, it may not. I don't keep up with my own channel, except for I recently crossed 1,000 subscribers on Theology Geek Fitness. But I was like, what would I do different? What would I do the same? The definitely thing that I would do different is I would never go to the gym. I would never, ever, ever go to the gym. I would just do the at home, at the office, wherever, whenever, however workouts with home fitness. Would never go to the gym. That's about the only thing that I think I said that I would do different. So now you don't have to watch my video on it, but you should go watch Derek's. I'm going to let's do it on the way home.
Well, I mean, I did plug your video that you did on that. And,
so it did come out.
Yeah. And so, and I kind of contrast myself because, we talked about it on Susan Morales' channel. It's like, we did essentially the same thing. We lost 75 pounds. You did it quick. Yeah, you did it quick. I did it.
Wanted it over with.
Yeah, my journey, I like to call it an epic, was far different. So
we don't use the word journey. Fitness journeys are for women.
Yes,
men have sagas.
Yeah, and so that's what
chronicles.
That's why I thought it was a good contrast with yours, because it's like we did the same thing. We agree on how we got there. It's just I have different mistakes than you did. So
yeah,
outline that.
But I did not change my thing. Diet, weight loss, and getting muscular and in shape sucks, and I would not change the speed at which I did it. It's going to suck. Whether do you want it to suck for a year? Do you want it to suck for 2 years, or do you want it to suck for as little as possible. And for me to lose 75 pounds was going to take 6 months and at the fastest. And so I just decided it's going to suck. So I'd rather it suck for a less amount of time and get the results sooner. Hardest thing I ever did. No lie. Hardest thing I've ever did.
That was the last piece of advice I gave, was essentially like, whatever you're doing, go hard. Go as
Get it over with. It's going to suck anyway. Why make it suck? You're going to be hungry. You're going to be cranky, hangry, or whatever. But you're building muscle and burning fat, and you look like a completely different human being when you're done. And it's not worth dragging that out forever, because get it over with as fast as possible. And then everyone's going to tell you, "Oh, that's not healthy and it's not sustainable." Yeah, it's sustainable. I haven't gone back to being a fatty. So, and I say that
kept it off.
Yeah,
3 years in.
You're overweight. I only talk. I'm not trying to be mean. I was right there with you. Everyone's seen my before and after pictures. If you haven't, you can go to Theology Geek Fitness. You can go to Derek's. He's got some chunky pictures of himself. And just remember, you're too beautiful to look like that. And I was too beautiful to look like that. And Derek was too beautiful to look like that. You could do better. If we could do it, I've got average to genetic. Nothing special about me. And in my heart of hearts, I'm still a fat Baptist, but I just don't look like one anymore. And I have to fight that all the time. But you're worth it. Go watch Derek's videos. Probably better than mine anyway. You probably put in effort in your videos. I put no effort in the Theology Geek Fitness whatsoever.
I'll let you be the judge.
All right. Next week, the big passage. I'm going to make Leighton Flowers show up and I'm going to make Tim Barber show up. I'm going to guilt him, but I can withhold Leighton's money because I want him to talk about Roman, because he has a take that I agree with him, and I agree. We might be arguing with everyone else about the ones that God foreknew being the Old Testament saints. That's like our most likely interpretation, but I know everyone's got a take on that, so we'll be hashing that out. In fact, we should probably do 26 through 30 and then save 31 through 39 on a different date, because it's going to suck up all the air just talking about 28 and 30, 29 and 30 anyway.
What's funny real quick about that, because you say the Old Testament saints, that's a conclusion I came to like years and years ago, but I didn't fully endorse it because I got so hung up on the glorification. It made sense with everything until I got to glorification, and it's like, no, should have just understood what that meant.
Yes.
Itself. But so yeah, no, I'm on board with that too. And I've been on board with that since before I even knew Leighton Flowers in my
yeah.
So
me too. But I'm glad he's on. I mean, percentages. I'm like, that's the most likely. I think I did a video on Trinity Radio, and I think Drew McLeod, he's been on the program a couple times. He clipped it out where I gave all the different takes on it, but I threw in it's talking about Han Solo and Chewbacca.
I remember that.
Being more likely than the Calvinist take on this path. Yeah, so there's a clip out there if you want to go to Provisionist Perspective, I think. Romans 8, Jonathan Pritchett. It's that one little clip where I lay out the different views and add ones that just to be facetious. But I'm like most likely, second most likely, third most likely, fourth most likely being a Star Wars reference, and then fifth most likely being the Calvinist reading. So go find that on YouTube. It's a fun video. And with that, we will see you next time oh, wait, before we see you next time, Derek, what is actually the name of your channel?
This.
Derek PG Beeler?
Derek PG Beeler until I find the need to change it to something else.
Okay. Go watch his video, and we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.